Superboy Prime betrayed Superman himself to fight beside the evil Legion of Darkseid. And today we're finally explaining what happened next because the new issue is finally here. Peak fiction incoming. So as we all know, the Absolute Universe has now started bleeding into DC's main universe, but when Superboy Prime and Superman traveled to the future together to help different teams of Legionnaires from different universes fight against Darkseid's Legion, they realized they were too late the very instant they arrived because Darkseid's Legion had already killed about 90% of the Legionnaires. And the Legionnaires that were still alive were stripped of any ounce of hope that they were trying to hold on to, fully convinced that they were destined for defeat at the hands of Darkseid. But soon enough, they were given a sliver of confidence when Superman praised them for their selfless acts while putting their lives on the line as the heroes of the future. They may have lost the battle, but the war was far from being settled. So they banded together to take one last shot at finding Booster Gold and stopping the Dark Legion, but eventually, in the midst of closing in on Booster's location, Superboy Prime realized they were walking amongst a wolf in sheep's clothing. Realizing that Cosmic Boy wasn't actually Cosmic Boy, but instead a version of Chameleon that was loyal to Darkseid, who upon being compromised, murdered Brainiac 5 without a moment's hesitation by turning his arm into a spear and jamming it through his chest. So Superboy Prime and the Legion began the process of trying to neutralize him, while Superman himself was overcome by so much rage that he began flying all over the place, demanding Darkseid to show himself. However, instead of running into Darkseid, he'd eventually come across where they were keeping Booster Gold, so he quickly relieved him of his shackles, stressing that they needed to get out of there as soon as possible, only to run into Darkseid's Legion just a few moments later, where not only was Booster Gold blasted onto the ground by Lightning Lad, but Superman was strangled by his neck before being lifted into the air when Superboy Prime revealed that he was joining Darkseid's forces. This issue, on the other hand, picks up during that exact same moment, but with Saturn Girl telling Superman her backstory as Superboy Prime continued to strangle him. So Saturn Girl was from a planet called Titan that was ruled by a powerful race of telepaths known as the Titanians. But eventually her planet broke out into war upon being attacked by another civilization from a different planet known as Brel. And just like the Titanians, the Brellians were incredibly powerful, but instead of having powers of telepathy, they wielded powers of magnetism. So eventually Saturn Girl willingly joined the war, killing one Brellian after another, but she was so dangerous, bloodthirsty, and ruthless that her success on the battlefield was rewarded with solitary confinement because her power was feared by her own people that deemed her to be too dangerous of a person to be out and about. But while she was locked away, she began to hear a voice, and a voice from that of none other than Darkseid himself. And with each day that passed, the voice grew louder and louder and louder until eventually telling her the secrets of everything, including Absolute Superman and everyone else who Darkseid believed was threatening his power. Now, it wasn't long after that before Saturn Girl was fully convinced that serving Darkseid was her true purpose. So one day, while being monitored by two of her facility's prison guards, she turned the guards against each other and forced them to kill one another by infiltrating both of their minds. But because she wasn't confident she could escape the facility by herself, she befriended none other than Cosmic Boy, who was also being held prisoner at the time despite the fact that he was a Brellian, because he promised he could use his magnetic powers to help them escape if she helped him remove his power-draining collar. And after that, the rest was history. Her and Cosmic Boy then traveled from world to world across the entire universe, gathering others who also felt Darkseid's presence to form his very own Legion. Nevertheless, hearing her story wasn't going to convince Superman that the future was lost, so he tried convincing Superboy that he was so much better than joining the ranks of Darkseid, but holding a grudge and completely disregarding what he had to say, Prime would then bash his forehead into Clark's face, shouting that this is what he deserved because he couldn't even give him something as simple as a team-up. Despite the display of violence though, Lightning Lad wasn't convinced that Superboy Prime was actually loyal to Darkseid, stating that they should just kill Superman and his little sidekick while they still had the chance. So Prime dared him to make a move, implying that he was capable of ripping his arm off and then beating him to death with it, but as Lightning Lad began summoning a powerful blast, Saturn Girl stated that they'd give Prime a chance to prove that he was actually in favor of their cause. Seeing all the discourse between them though, Superman believed they were vulnerable enough to catch them off guard, so he ripped Superboy Prime's hand off his neck, urging Booster Gold to try making a run for it, but it wasn't long before Colossal Boy snatched him up within the palm of his hand before slamming him into the ground just moments later, where the entire Legion would then band together, hitting Clark with one blast after the other until he couldn't defend himself any longer. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, Saturn Girl would then rise up into the air, staring down at Booster Gold while explaining that they needed to sacrifice him because not only was his body infused with chronal energy, energy that granted the ability to travel through time, but he was also holding on to Omega energy, and Darkseid needed every bit of Omega energy in existence in order to make his return. Now after that we see what I'm pretty sure is the same exact machine that Darkseid used to bond with the Spectre in DC's All-In Special before the Absolute Universe was even created. And upon strapping Booster Gold onto the machine, Saturn Girl would then express that once the machine was fueled by his blood, it would send Omega energy into the barriers between time and space, resulting in a path being opened up for Darkseid to make his return. But as Element Lad began using his powers to activate the machine and open the portal, Superman began begging them to stop and stating that there had to be at least a sliver of goodness deep down in Saturn Girl's heart. But claiming that she wasn't the Saturn Girl he knew, she then ordered Superboy Prime to prove that he was truly loyal to Darkseid by executing the final step, which was executing Booster Gold. So Prime walked over to Booster's beaten up and broken down body as Superman begged him not to do this from the top of his lungs. But right before delivering the killing blow, Prime would then ask Clark if he remembered what Time Trapper told them before they made their separate ways. He was there to do what Superman could never do, and that thing was making Darkseid's Legion believe that he was actually on their side. And immediately after saying this, he'd send a massive portion of the Dark Legion flying backwards into the air by blasting them with his heat vision before literally winding up into a miniature tornado, clobbering Saturn Girl with a devastating right hook that sent her crashing into a nearby rock formation. So Lightning Lad tried intervening by charging up as much power as he possibly could, only to meet the same fate as the others when Prime smashed him into the ground face first. Knowing that he couldn't win this all on his own though, Superman would then use every ounce of strength he had to break free of his confines despite being massively weakened, giving him just enough time to use his freeze breath on some of the other Legionnaires as Superboy Prime freed Booster Gold so he could send him back home by throwing him into the time stream. And with that, he then flashed Superman a smile, stating that he better go get Booster Gold or he was gonna get lost somewhere in time. But Clark wasn't going anywhere before showing how grateful he was for Superboy by giving him his personal Legionnaire ring. However, their work was far from over because it wasn't long before the Legion of Darkness was back on their feet and headed their way. So Superman emphasized that they needed to combine their forces and defeat them together so they could both make it back home safely. But even though Superman refused to leave his side, Superboy stated that he needed to leave immediately because Time Trapper told him that in order to save the future, Superman and Booster Gold needed to save the past. Which is exactly when he smacked Clark back into the time stream, telling him not to hold back when he eventually came across Darkseid, before him and the other good Legionnaires that were still alive banded together once again to take down as much of the Dark Legion as they could while Superman traveled back home through the time stream. And as soon as him and Booster made it to Earth Prime, he made an emergency call to his fellow heroes, urging them to contact every single available member of the Justice League and stating that they needed to meet up at the Watchtower as soon as freaking possible. But sadly, that's where this issue comes to an end. But if you guys want to know what happens next, let me know in the comments down below.